We move on to the next panel, that is panel 2 for advocacy. And we have all the panels lined up, and I will introduce Rakhi Israni very briefly with her bio. She's founder and president for Excel Test Prep. She is an attorney by profession and also holds an MBA from Rice University. She's a second generation Hindu American and has been very active in community activities for the Hindu society for most of her life. Welcome, Rakhi, and all the esteemed panelists of panel 2. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So we're very excited about this panel. This panel is on advocacy. As Hindu Americans, we are one of the most educated and wealthiest communities in this country. We have the power, the intelligence, and the economic strength to move mountains, not only in this country, but around the world, but yet we don't. The role, the visibility, and influence of a community are determined by its power in the following 3 spheres of influence: media, politics, and education. Those are the 3 areas that we will cover today. And since everything starts at home, we felt it was important to include this area as well. I'm very excited to introduce our panel for this talk. All 4 panels have an amazing perspective on the advocacy efforts happening in these areas. The first panelist is Shambhav Sharma. I'm sure everyone knows him. He is a creator and host of the Sham Sharma Show. It's a channel that speaks up for India's indigenous cultures. The show's goal is to tell the Indian culture side of the story in politics, pop culture, news, and social media, whether in India or in the West. The second panelist is Samir Kalra. He's the managing director at the Hindu American Foundation. Samir is the managing director of the Hindu American Foundation. He holds a Juris Doctorate from Santa Clara University School of Law and is licensed to practice law in California. He leads the foundation's human rights and public policy advocacy efforts and has led human rights fact-finding missions, advocacy campaigns, and served as a panelist at multiple congressional briefings on human rights in South Asia. He has published dozens of articles on human rights, foreign policy, immigration. He's authored formal testimony and comments for several congressional hearings and policy bodies on foreign and domestic policy issues. He's also spearheaded the foundation's textbook reform initiative and has testified at California State Assembly and Senate committee hearings on education and hate crimes. He previously served on Representative Eric Swalwell's Immigration Advisory Committee. The third panelist we have is Brahmachari Sharanji. He is the director of Dharmic Life and Hindu spiritual advisor at Georgetown University. He moved to Washington, D.C. from London to serve as the full-time director at Georgetown in 2016, making him the first Hindu monk to serve at a Catholic institution. He is also an adjunct professor in Georgetown's Department of Theology and Linguistics. His academic training is in Indology, Sanskrit, classical Indian intellectual systems, Indian religious traditions and society, medieval Braj literature, and Vedanta. He's also an instructor of Hindu priests and holds the title of Yagyacharya. And our fourth panelist is Ms. Aparna Rayasam. She has over 23 years of experience in security, distributed systems, machine learning, data science, enterprise software, working on some of the most challenging technical problems in the industry. She's currently the Vice President of Engineering in the Web Security BU at Akamai. She's also a passionate advocate for the Women's Forum Employee Resource Group at her company. Her academic qualifications include a computer science degree from Bangalore University in India and MIT. I welcome all four of you. Thank you so much for being on this panel. I'd like to start with Sham. Sham will actually address the media side of this topic. Sham, sure.
Thank you very much, Rakhi, for the invite. And I want to also thank Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America for inviting and holding this incredible discussion as well. And I'm very happy and I feel very privileged to be part of this. When it comes to sort of the media and the entertainment landscape, I wanted to structure what I'm going to say in terms of like the past and the present, what's going on right now, and some of the challenges that I think the Hindu community and the Indic community in general is going to be facing sort of going forward when it comes to finding and creating its voice on new media. So in the past, we've seen that how the academic, the education, and the media establishment in India has been under the control of a class of intellectuals who've had their own idea of India, and they've worked very hard to sort of impose this idea of India on a very large section of the population. And this section of intellectuals, for a very long time, and still are, very well funded and very well taken care of, whether it's by the Indian government, whether it's by private businesses in India, whether it's, foreign sources, whether it's missionary organizations, Islamic countries, foreign news organizations, foreign universities, foreign think tanks, and things like that. And the kind of stranglehold that they did have on the Indian pop culture, on the Indian media scene, it really showed in obviously the news media, and it also showed in, if you look at TV shows and movies. There's a very now famous study done by Dheeraj Sharma of IIM, where he randomly selected 50 movies from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, and he looked to see how characters from different religious backgrounds were portrayed, and the findings were that a large section of characters that had Hindu names were portrayed as scheming, devious, greedy, only looking out for their own self-interests. The Sikh characters were sort of portrayed as comic relief and therefore comedy only. But the Muslim characters there were portrayed as very upstanding, very devout, very moral, kind of like the moral center of the entire story, like the Rahim Chacha in Sholay and things like that. And so that's just a very small example of the kind of stranglehold that they've had on the minds of the people for such a long time. And before the age of the internet, there really was no other avenue for people who disagreed with this mindset, who disagreed with the ideas of this intellectual class, to exist independently. There's a great book by Arun Shourie. It's called Eminent Historians, Their Technology, Their Line, and Their Fraud, which really talks about how people that wanted to disagree with this intellectual class were bullied, ignored, or almost completely excommunicated. There's the example of the great Hindu scholar Sitaram Goyal. There's a more recent example of K.K. Muhammad from the Archaeological Survey of India, who did the excavation of the Babri Masjid site, and how he was bullied, how he was threatened with excommunication just because he wanted to publish the information as he found and not, put a secular coat of paint on the information. And the whole Ayodhya issue, I think, in general, is a wonderful example of how, despite overwhelming evidence, these intellectuals that controlled these institutions and had such a large amount of influence in media were able to bury the evidence and bury any calls for justice for such a long time. And that sort of brings us to the present. And the big leveler in many ways has been the onset of the internet, the arrival on the internet. And it really has been a godsend for the Indic voice, the internet. And I think the big gift that the internet has given to the Indian people and the Indian civilization in general, it really cannot be understated. It has really democratized the discourse in ways that was pretty much impossible before the age of the internet. And this was a huge reason also for the groundswell of support behind Narendra Modi's campaign in 2013, 2014. It has also allowed for the lies of this sort of intellectual class controlled media to be debunked. It has given a voice to people that felt like they had none. And as a result of this, you might have seen podcasts, discussions, talks, videos, content creators, I suppose, like myself, who've been able to get a small toehold in the discourse, which was considered pretty much impossible, just a few decades ago. And so as a result of the internet, the Indic voice today is stronger than it has ever been in post-independence India. It is much harder for that intellectual sort of elite to spread the lies that they used to be able to. Just think in the past 5 years, the whole Award Vapasi narrative, the whole Lynchistan narrative, the whole sort of these kinds of narratives that were tried to be created, they were largely sort of debunked in India. And even in the media side, even in the movies and TV side that I was talking about earlier, now there's a signal from the internet to movie makers, to creators, that movies based on Indic narratives, movies based on Hindu narratives, movies based on Hindu heroes can be successful in India. You know, now you have movies like Uri, like Tanaji, like Bahubali that are incredibly successful in India as well. And so things are better today than they were even 20 years ago, without a shadow of a doubt. But then this also brings with itself, you know, a set of its own challenges, that even though these narratives that I talked about earlier were able to be defeated in India to a large extent, they still got a lot of traction in the West. So I think the next big challenge is going to be to get that Indic voice out of India, and to get that Indic voice to make a space for itself in Western media, in Western new media as well. Because the same intellectual establishment and the same media establishment that had a stranglehold on old media is now trying to develop that same stranglehold on new media as well. And remember that they're still extremely well funded. So there is still a very big imbalance when it comes to sort of that funding and sustainability when it comes to this intellectual class and the Hindu voice. And so the big challenge that I see personally in my experience has been, to an extent, apathy. And that is going to be a challenge that we're going to keep facing in the future as well, is that apathy, because we see that to some extent in the younger generation as well. And when we're talking about new media, we're looking to engage that younger generation, which is more increasingly present on that new media, more increasingly present on that audio-visual medium. So there's a lot of great intellectual work being done, you know, on the Hindu front now, and it's going to continue in the future. But I think, from my experience, what we really need to focus on in the future is that audiovisual medium. So think of it like, you know, you're trying to feed some people their vegetables, the younger generation, their vegetables, and vegetables are a little bit unappetizing. So what we need to do now is to package and present these vegetables in a way that it becomes very easily consumable for this generation. And so, you know, well-produced, visually engaging, easy to consume Indic content presented in a easy to consume way as well will sort of become the gateway to a more serious intellectual exploration of Indian culture, Indian history, and Indian ideology. Now, it's important to make sure that the voice that the internet has provided to the Indic civilization, it becomes sustainable for the future. And so that's where the big challenge comes, is that the only way that this voice will become sustainable is through proper support, proper funding. You know, Hindus, I heard in previous talks as well on this panel that Hindus are an extremely well-to-do community within the US, a very successful community within the US. And like I said before, that the intellectuals that control the old media that are very well-funded are now trying to control new media as well. And in a lot of cases, they're succeeding. So the Hindu community now needs to carve a space in this new media for themselves. And to do that, at the end of the day, I believe that the big challenge for us is going to be to put our money where our mouth is, essentially. And, you know, just to wrap up, I'll give you a quick anecdote that when I started my own channel, I used to hear from my family, I used to hear from my relatives, I used to hear from family friends all the time that, oh, we're very happy that you started this channel, you're doing a great job, but why do you want to make money from it? I mean, you're doing this, do it out of the love, because you have this love for this civilization, you love this culture so much, do it out of love. And I always think to myself, I am doing it out of love, and I have a lot of love to give, but at the end of the day, love is not going to pay the bills, love is not going to put food on the table, love is not going to pay rent. So if we are serious about creating this voice, if we are serious about creating this kind of advocacy, then you need people, you need media entities that are involved in this new media absolutely full time and are run as, you know, media businesses. That is the only way that we're going to be able to carve out a space for ourselves. And if we want to take this new media seriously. And so as individuals and as businesses in the future, if we're serious about creating this voice, if we're serious about finding success in new media, then it's important to come together, band together, like I said, as individuals and businesses, and to fund these new media enterprises. Find creators or media companies or blogs or platforms that you like, either start your own, or if you like some, then it's important to help them become financially viable and financially sustainable, because the internet at the end of the day has made this Indic voice a reality, and proper backing and proper support is what's going to make it sustainable. So hopefully that's a little bit of food for thought, and thank you again.
Thank you, Shyam. You're a perfect example of how you've used the internet to make our message more fun. Like, vegetables, right? Making a child eat a vegetable. In the same way, I think that, I watch your show regularly, and it does make it a lot more understandable for the general American public, for sure. Thank you, Shyam. Samir, I'd like to go to you. Samir will tell us, where we are on the political side and where we're going. Samir.
Namaste and good morning, everyone. Thank you, first of all, to VHPA for putting on this conference and this conversation and having me as a panelist. It's my honor to be here with my other esteemed panelists and having Rocky moderate the panel for us. So I want to talk very briefly about, as we reflect on the past 50 years, where we've been, where we are now, and where we're going forward, what has been the track record of Hindu Americans in politics? What has been the influence? What has been the effectiveness? And as we look at that, I want to use a few different measures to use as metrics to see what we've done and where our successes have been and where perhaps we've fallen short. The way I would address or assess, our effectiveness in politics, or Hindu Americans in politics more generally, is number one, what has our financial influence been? How have we effectively used our financial influence? And that doesn't just mean on influencing politicians or elected officials or candidates. It also means something that Shyam alluded to, investing in professionalized advocacy. We treat this as a profession that deserves the same respect and therefore the same investment and the same sense of we want to encourage our children to go into these areas that we do being a doctor, engineer, or lawyer. Number two is grassroots mobilization. Have we effectively been able to mobilize our grassroots community collectively around specific issues, and what have been the outcomes of that? Number three is, have we had consistent and strategic advocacy? And the reason I use those two words, consistent and strategic, is because advocacy can be a lot of different things, but if you don't do it consistently and systematically, you're not going to be successful. It'll come in waves, it'll come and go in waves. And that is part of what we've seen in the past. Strategically, I use that word is because there's an importance of understanding how the system works and how to be effective in the system and what works and what doesn't work. An example of that would be petitions. We all love petitions as a community because the low barrier to entry to actually do something there, but do we actually think about how effective it is? And so what is strategic advocacy versus just advocacy for the sake of advocacy? And finally, what is the presence of Hindu Americans in politics? And when I say politics, I don't, again, just mean as candidates, as elected officials, but I mean as staffers in offices. Understanding that the staff members in elected officials' offices play very, very important roles. I just had a number of meetings as part of the Hindu American Foundation's Virtual Advocacy Forum last week, and I can't tell you how many Muslim staffers we ended up dealing with. It's a sign of success for that community is the presence of not just elected officials, but staffers within those offices, because they often hold the keys to influencing how a policymaker votes on an issue or what issues they take up. What is the presence of our community in politics, from staffers to very, very local elected offices such as school state board of education, to local city councils, to state offices, all the way up to congressional offices? We have a tendency to kind of hyper focus on who's in Congress, who's in the Senate, and pay more attention to that. But it has to start at the local level as well, because at the end of the day, that's what impacts our lives most directly. Kind of looking at that overall, where have we been in the past? In the past 50 years, well, unfortunately, the story is not a positive one, with a few exceptions. The exceptions I would highlight are, one, the US-India nuclear deal, and that was an example of effective advocacy, collective advocacy, financial influence, everything coming together, strategic advocacy using the institutions that were in place, such as the Senate India Caucus, the House India Caucus, to effectively advocate on that issue. That was one example of a success. However, for the most part, we haven't really done much beyond, very symbolic measures. Some of the failures have been very, publicized, have been very openly publicized, such as the denial of Narendra Modi's visa when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat. The influence of their bodies in, like the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, the State Department, in their descriptions of India and their record of religious freedom. I think it's important also to view the prism of the past through two distinct phenomena. So one is Cold War era politics, where India was always seen as being more close to the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and therefore a lot of our foreign policy was directed towards supporting Pakistan and not necessarily strengthening US-India ties. The second major move has been the influence of evangelical conservatives on India and policy towards India, and that has been more on the realm of human rights issues, religious freedom. Who have been some of the politicians in the past that have supported India or conversely have gone against India? Again, this is a mixed bag because there hasn't been the consistency of advocacy, there hasn't been the investment, and there hasn't been a real effectiveness in trying to put Hindu Americans strategically in the right positions from the bottom of at the local level all the way to the top. We've seen elected officials in the past that have been staunch allies and friends of India, such as former Congressman Ed Royce from Southern California, be staunch allies of India, but then because advocacy wasn't consistent or financial influence wasn't consistent, they've turned on India. And that happened within the last few years before he was out of office, with the case of a Christian missionary group in India that was denied access to India anymore. And he was from the Republican Party. Similarly, we see friends from the Democratic side that have turned on the community as well. Brad Sherman was one of the biggest advocates for India. He was very vocal in his criticism of Pakistan previously, and he was the co-chair of the India Caucus. What happened? The consistent advocacy, the financial influence subsided or was surpassed by those that seek to undermine U.S.-India relations or to frame India in a certain box or Hindus in a certain box. There are a number of other examples, of pro and anti-India legislators in the past. We have, most people would know the name Dan Burton when I say the name Dan Burton. Dan Burton was one of the most vocal and critical people on India. He was getting support from the pro-Khalistan lobby. He was getting support from Ghulam Nabi Faiz of the world. And our community wasn't doing anything to counter that influence. And so it's been a very mixed track record in terms of the actual political leaders that have supported us. If we go to the present and where we are today, it's similar. We see certain trends occurring where there is, more criticism of India, but a lot of this, I think, has been hyper polarized because it's been playing out over social media. This is where the media and politics come together. So there's been a perception, and to some degree it is correct, that there is trends in the Democratic Party. We see lawmaker after lawmaker from the Democratic side being critical of India over the last year, in particular since 2019 with the abrogation of Article 370, as well as the passage and implementation of the Citizenship Amendment Act that have been vocally critical of India. And those, of course, range from the Pramila Jayapals to the Ro Khannas to the Brad Shermans, who was once an ally, to the Rashida Tlaibs and the Squad, as they're lovingly called, and many others. But if you really look at the reality, it's not as one-sided as we would believe, because there are a lot of Republicans also that have been critical of India, that have been trying to promote a anti-India, which often trickles down to an anti-Hindu view. Within the last few days, there was a Senate-led letter sent to the State Department actually asking for India to be classified by the State Department as a country of particular concern. This category is reserved for the worst and most egregious violators of religious freedom, and it has the likes of Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, China, and some of those really, really bad countries. They asked India to be put on this list. Not only that, they've taken a step further and asked to have sanctions put on India, as well as individual Indian officials that they allege have committed acts of violations of religious freedom. Now, out of 14 senators that were on that letter, 10 were Republicans. So if we really look at this, it's coming from both sides right now. On the left, it's coming from these uber leftist kind of Marxist ideology that have joined hands with Islamists. On the right, it comes still from those evangelical Christians that are still trying to push against India and trying to frame it in a certain way, because their ultimate goal is, right, open up India to convert basically freely and have the government, create conditions on the ground that it makes it easier for them to do that. So while yes, I mean, if we were to really look statistically, there have been more Democrats that have been vocally speaking out on India, critical of India on issues like Kashmir and the Amendment Act. There are a lot of Republicans that have also been critical of India as well, and they're getting their support more from the evangelical conservative Christian base. That being said, the positive side of that, and I know there's a positive somewhere in here, is that the actual policy right now towards India has not changed a lot. And that is the plus. So despite all the noise, all the theatrics that happened with the famous House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing led by, Brad Sherman last year, where, there was all these dramatics being, played out there. Actual U.S. administrative policy towards India has not changed. In fact, it's gotten better. The U.S. policy is actually sided with India in the recent dispute with China. So in that sense, that's the positive, and that is to some extent due to advocacy. But I think what happens is that if we are looking in the court of public opinion, which is obviously related to politics, is very negative, and it feels like we're losing this battle. But what can we do going forward? What are the answers to some of this? And so, I think people get really caught up on people like Brahma and Jayapal and Ro Khanna and their likes. And while they're disappointing for different reasons, we shouldn't focus on them. What we need to focus on our own actions as a community and what we can do, because a lot of the other things are out of our hands. Elected officials are going to come and go, but if we have the infrastructure, if we have the effectiveness, the culture of advocacy, as I would like to call it, built into our community, it doesn't matter who's in office. We can influence policy in a positive way to address our issues both here domestically as well as on the foreign policy end. But we can also have those systems in place consistently over the long. That's what the Jewish community has done. They've invested in advocacy over the long run. And so all is not lost. I think the future is still bright. I think we can still accomplish a lot. If we look at what that entails, it entails a few things. Number one is going back to what the measures I established earlier on was, how do we use our financial resources? One, we invest in advocacy organizations. We invest in candidates, officials, party workers, people that can climb within the party apparatus and on both sides of the aisle. And we make sure that we invest smartly in those people that are going to be open about their Hindu identity, and for non-Hindus, people that are going to not just take our money, but are going to actually do something, and we're going to be able to hold them accountable. So the joke was that Indian Americans or Hindu Americans are the easiest donors because they gave money but didn't ask for anything in return besides a photo op. And so it's important that as the community, as we invest in a way that we can hold officials accountable, we invest smartly, and we invest strategically, and we use that influence strategically. Number two is collective action through grassroots, grass tops advocacy. Grassroots meaning using the masses effectively, using the tools of advocacy effectively. Grass top being able to do those meetings and actually educating the policy makers in a more strategic manner effectively. So as I alluded to before, petitions. So petitions, they may have certain uses, but overall they're not going to be effective. So how do we use effective tools? We use tools that help us effectively reach offices through individualized emails, but done in a mass and systematic manner. We make calls to offices. We have people that are at the grassroots levels in districts across the country organizing meetings, but we do it around a common agenda. We have a common message. We have common talking points. We have a common narrative to tell. We have a common story to tell. Being angry on the internet is not going to get us anywhere. Signing a petition with 10,000 people, 9,000 people of which are outside of the US and in India is not going to get us anywhere. And I'm not saying this to be tongue-in-cheek. I'm saying this because it needs to be a wake-up call that we need to get our acts together. The other thing is that we cannot be reactive to advocacy. We see all these Citizenship Amendment Act resolutions, anti-India resolutions, the anti-India resolutions over Kashmir happening in cities across the country. Now, if we try to stop it, we've already lost the game because we're reacting to it. So how do we be proactive in trying to build the relationships at the local, state, and federal level ahead of time, being consistent in that advocacy, educating them not just on the issues, but on the community, branding ourselves as a community effectively, and then when the time comes, we're already positioned in the place to be able to effectively get our policy asks or legislative priorities on their agendas, and they're more likely to take it seriously. Once we are trying to stop something from happening, it's over, because the other side has been working for years to build those relationships. They've created a strategic, comprehensive strategy to do it in, God knows how many places across the country, and it leaves us being on the defensive and playing whack-a-mole. It's going to pop up one place, we try to stop it there. They do it somewhere else, we go and try to stop it there. But that's not effective advocacy. Effective advocacy is also understanding this is a long game, right? It starts with building long-term relationships, consistent relationships, cultivating those relationships, pairing that with financial influence and financial investment, and then mobilizing people around a common agenda. And so in that sense, I think the positive here, again, I want to end with a positive, is that I feel that people are, awakening to the dangers that are out there, the challenges that are out there. Because, when all of this happens, if it's dealing with US-India issues, it ultimately veers into Hindu phobia and anti-Hindu sentiment and a demonization of the community. If it's dealing with local issues or state issues, it's basically affecting us on a daily life. It's what's happening to us, whether it's in textbooks, whether it's in hate crimes, whether it's in immigration issues. So the impact is direct, whether it's foreign policy issues or domestic issues. I think, as we go forward in the future, platforms that Sham has started, I think, are helping in this matter in educating people, raising that awareness. And that's the first step. Then it's coming together collectively. Whether we have disagreements on different issues, we have to come together collectively. We have to bring organizations together, and we have to kind of move towards one common goal. And that's what the other side has done, and that's what we can learn both from those that are opposing us, as well as model communities such as the Jewish community going forward. So I think the future is still bright. I think this is to some extent the natural evolution of an immigrant, newly formed, arriving immigrant community. We have to remember we have, for the most part, come here in the 60s in large numbers. And the first emphasis was on education and creating financial security. The next step now is advocacy. And I think that's going to take us to the wave in the future, creating a positive identity and then advocating around that going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Samir. You're right. I mean, we have spent a lot of time kind of building up our wealth, and we have the power to connect. We just need to get connected, and we need to stay focused on what our message is as a community. If we don't do it, no one will. So thank you so much, Samir. Now I'd like to go to Brahmacharyaji to talk about the education side, especially given his perspective on the college campuses and dealing with Hindu youth and dealing with others in the education side. Brahmacharyaji.
Namaste, Sarvebhyo Pranamami. It is lovely to see you all, and thank you to the VHPA for extending this invitation to join you all. Rakhi, you're doing a wonderful job, and it is a lovely blessing to be in the same panel with Shamji, with Samirji, with Aparnaji. Very interesting sentiments have already been aired, not only in this panel, but also in the panels previous. And I come to you from within the silo of education. And in this wonderful silo, I have the privilege of the ability to say, I'm going to be turning the critical eye on our lovely people. I'm 100% through and through all of my generations Hindu. And because of that, I'm going to speak a little bit of a karwa sach, a little bit of a bitter truth. Because before we're able to run on any of these different avenues, we need to sort out our approaches to education. The United States of America is a very confusing place for people who have just immigrated over from India, where we in India have the national curriculum set, which has been based on the University of London's secular approach to education. Now, obviously, in India, that was used by missionaries who were the teachers of that secular approach to education. However, in the United States, most, at least 90% of all colleges of repute have their origins in Christianity, Christian traditions, and as seminaries in most cases. Have we been able to develop the technology, to develop the wherewithal, to understand what effect that has on our students? My simple answer is, I don't think so yet. So if we're looking at the 50 years going forward from here, I'm hopeful that if we do want, our perception to change through media, or if we do want the ability to have a say in the world's on the world stage through advocacy, whatever we do, it depends on getting this moment in time right. Now, number one, we have a couple of challenges. Do we recognize the effect of colonization on our tradition's knowledge base? I don't think we do. I think we get to the part where the British were evil and all of this stuff, and we all harp back to colonization, as we rightly should. But we then forget that there were the Portuguese Empire. We forget the Go Inquisition. We forget the effects of having schools that regularly praise the actors of those times. What that has on our people, what that has when our people then move to the United States, and then when their children grow up in homes where the Catholic education, the education from St. Xavier's, the education from St. Thomas's, all are touted as the reason why they're so successful. Yeah. Second part of this goes a little bit deeper. We, unfortunately, overlook one major part of our Dharma. Our Dharma is an oral tradition. Now, that doesn't mean that Nani said this and Dadi said that, and that's what our Dharma is. That is a significant portion. If you read the Paraskar Griya Sutra, which is what we use as our ritual guides, Paraskar Griya Sutra gives a very, very prominent place to the, the customs and the rituals of the family as mediated by the women. Without their say, a wedding cannot be complete, for example, no matter how learned the Pandit is, right? But in that same vein, the oral society was dependent on people who had studied for 12 years the depth of our Dharma. They could quote to you, on the one hand, the Veda, the Dharma Shastras, and on the other hand, they could also quote the Mahabharata story, which overruled everything that was talked about in the Veda and in the Dharma Shastra. Why is that as important? Because without that, we become a stagnant, reactionary society without the ability to dynamically deal with the challenges of today. We are not able to do that because we as a Hindu society have not focused on regenerating in the past 70 years since we've been independent in India. We've not focused on regenerating that group of people that can deal with the dynamic interpretations of these texts. Where someone was saying earlier, and I thought about it, and I thought it was very interesting. If we ever have a problem, we can always go back to the Gita and read it. That's the approach of Christians with the Bible. That's not the approach of dharmic people. The dharmic people, they go to someone who has knowledge of that situation. Whether it is, an auntie that has seen many of her younger generation go through marriages and the trials and tribulations, or whether that is the guru that knows the Dharma Shastras or the Veda or Vedanta, whatever the interest happens to be. That piece of the entire equation is out, and I'll tell you the effects of it. Because we resort to the Christian method, and I'm using the word Christian method if you look up the origins of most of the systems in our lovely Bharat Desha, you'll find that it is specifically the evangelical, the Clapham evangelicals who were behind the British Empire's policies on a lot of the curriculum, etc. in India. But we come to a place where, because we're not able to effectively understand how the values of our Dharma play out. Externally, we use talwars. Externally, we might be, using sharp language at people. But internally also, we use that same sharp language on people. The ability to live from a values-based society is gone when it comes to dealing with our youth. And so when people always ask, where are the youth? Where are the youth? Where are the youth? How do we engage the youth? One of the most important things that is taught at the end of Sikshavali in the Taittiriya Upanishad is very simple. Find people who know. Learn how they're doing it. Make sure they are virtuous. Emulate them. Don't copy them. Emulate their method. Right? We've been unable to do that when it comes to our children. And when our children are now in the places like these universities, which have Indology-based understandings of South Asia and ancient India, and also current Hindus, when our children are given that kind of information in the classroom, when it's reinforced by the stereotypes that are presented on current media and in film, etc., but also when they're hearing it from their friends who've grown up learning about Hindus from their own traditions and then from the secular quote-unquote curriculum, then when they go home and they hear the sharp tongues of our parents against other people or against a question, for example, somebody said, Hindus don't have priests. Of course we don't have priests. We have to use that language because we're in an Anglophone society that's based off of Christianity, right? We know internally what we mean is Purohita, not even Pandit, but Purohita. But externally, to speak to people outward-facingly, we have to use the word priest. And then once they're listening to us, once we develop that relationship with them that is based on our values, that they find us as kind and approachable human beings, then we can tell them that, actually in our tradition, we use the words Purohit and Pandit. Now that's an entire separate thing. I'm coming back now to my point, which was, how do we deal with the university situation? How do we deal with educational approaches? There is the academic side, and there are some academics in the United States that are working very hard to change the course of academic approaches to the study of not only Hindu Dharma, but Dharma in general, because they have, quite frankly, Brian Pennington, people like Will Sweetman, have realized that Hinduism and the word religion do not cover what is meant by dharmas in our traditions. And our variety of traditions, the multiplicity of voices, the plurality of approaches should not be stamped under this religio-politic understanding of what religion is. The other side of the educational experience is what I want to talk to you about today. Student affairs is a very big portion of a university student's life. You can take your child to the mandir as much as you want for the first 16, 17 years that they're in your home. However, from 17 through to 21, they are firmly in the possession of the university systems. They're living there, their friends are from there, and the activities are all guided by the university's mission. Look up the university's mission where your child goes to, and look up the history of that mission. Because obviously as time has gone on, they've watered down any religious language used in that mission. Go back to the ethos, the original ethos of that mission. You will find Christianity at its roots. Over the years, they have learned that they need to secularize, but they do not remove from it the kind of pathways, those open doors that lead one down to the Christian approach. I want to say that this is an opportunity. I want to say that Hindus, if, like Shyamji and Samirji have been talking about, if we really understand the concept of Dashans Dan, which was 10% Dan in charity, we used to give as dharmic people before people said, oh, no, seva is all rubbish. They were basically trying to destabilize our financial systems. Once the intellectuals' heads were off their body, destabilize the financial system, and then you will not have anywhere to go. Obviously, you go to Mandir now, Aarti Thali, we have thousands and hundreds of thousands. The bank, we're still only putting $1 bill in the Aarti Thali. I mean, come on. What are we doing? What are we doing? Invest in university experiences for your children. Arrange cultural heritage tours to Bharat. Not only Bharat. Think about the Indosphere. The Indosphere extends not only from Afghanistan through to Southeast Asia, but also through to Japan. Send our students to these places. Let them see how our people used to interact with other people, so much so that they were ready to listen to those concepts that were great in our tradition. Make it their own. Those things are eye-opening for students. That's part one. But part two is listen to these students. If the students are saying that Black Lives Matters is an important thing to their understanding, then without saying, oh, all lives matters, say, okay, tell me why. Listen. The listening portion of our Dharma, that oral tradition that is central, that's what I want to put out there as one of the key methods of improving our state in the United States of America in the 50 years that we're going forward. Keep talking with the youth, keep listening to the youth, figure out that we have parallels with ancient African, Native American, and other First Nation peoples, leverage the political approaches, the political protections that are afforded to those people, and learn to live with our values and our Dharma. We cannot be Kshatriyas if we don't have any scholars to guide us. Bring back the scholars, invest in the scholars, and you will see that our problems will be a little bit less in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Brahmachariji. Yes, I mean, I think the children are our future, and we have to spend the time to teach them and to watch how we react to things to form their own perception. Now we have our fourth panelist, Aparnaji. We'll talk about advocacy at home, which none of the other stuff matters unless we start teaching our own kids the importance of our culture and who we are. Aparnaji.
Namaste. Sadashiva Samarambha Asmadacharya Paryanta Vande Guru Parampara. Sabhaye Namaha. I bow down to this August assembly of not just of the thoughts, but even the intent to discuss and improve the awareness and the pride in Sanatan Dharma. So I bow down to the intent, and thank you, Rakhi, for moderating, and thank you all the esteemed panelists for your phenomenal opinions. It is a great pleasure. Rakhi gave a very flattering introduction for myself. I think there is a portion of the introduction that I will complete. I have been involved in running a Bal Vihar in some form or the other for the last 10 plus years, at least 15 years in America. And, I have raised 2 kids in America as well, and raising. So I speak about this topic from both my personal experience as a teacher and as a bit of an anthropologist and as also a parent. So I want to take us all to, a few hundred years ago when Bharat was flourishing, when the Sanatan Dharma was flourishing. The milieu then, the society then had strong temples. Temples were the centers of culture and education. So the temples, back to Brahmachariji's, discussion about the learned, temples were where technology was built. Temples where science was encouraged. Temples were where this science was spread as through osmosis, through dance dramas, through people meeting each other. And so it wasn't, all you had to do at home was, in most cases, bring your child to the temple, make sure that the child respected the teacher at the temple, or in a few cases, exceptional cases, you had to reinforce what the child was being taught, because the society as a large regarded what was being taught in the temples as education above everything else. There was no other education. The education came from there. So fast forward a few years, for for a variety of reasons, we know the calamitous invasions that India has had over the past many centuries meant that the invaders first destroyed the temples, because that once you destroyed the temples, it was fairly easy to firstly to cut the ecosystem, and then it was easy to negate, because they knew there are some very famous stories where, despite the multiple invasions, the dharma and the dharmic thought and the influence of this thought was still flourishing. And one of the most infamous invaders actually found out that the reason was that even his own people were following the dharma that was being taught in the Kashi Vishwanath temple, for example. So immediately the invaders trained their eye towards the temple to destroy that, because they knew that once you destroy that, you almost destroy the source of it. So fast forward to that, a lot of the culture building, dharmic teaching had to move to some other place. And in most places, it had to move to home. And this is where, in the last many years, let's say the last 100 or so years, you have some people in some homes where there is a strong culture of understanding and passing that on to the next generation. You find those strong roots where the actual thought is not as strongly motivated or even not well understood. The children, and most of them, my current generation, end up being fairly confused, because there is a sense that this is part of my history, this is part of my tradition. Nani ne kaha hai, dadi ne kaha hai, maa ne kaha hai. These are, they are part of your psyche, they're part of your conscience, but it's not obviously traceable to what they contribute to future. I want to bring us all to something like 20 years ago, when there was a fairly reasonably sized exodus into the United States by a bunch of Indians. Now, most of these Indians are all, they are moving to America. They're not fleeing away persecuting society. They're not fleeing away. They're not migrants for, they're not coming for security. They're coming for economic, in many ways, economic motivations, because they believe that this society enabled their education and their further growth, material growth, their expansion into different areas. So with these being the motivations, a large part of the education was focused on your fundamentals like English, English language, science, and math. Culture was almost a given. Culture was something that was, like we said, it grew in osmosis. Now, fast forward to when most of us come to America. For the first few years, once you are here, most of us are focused on education. Most of us are focused on careers. Once you have children, then it starts to hit home to say, hey, my child needs to learn about their culture, because I know there is something fundamentally great about it. But where do you go? There is no standardization of the culture. There is no dharmic culture. There is no one book that tells you exactly what you should do. And even if there was such a book, you don't even know what that is and how you were to do that, how you were to go about it. So therefore, even the modern interpretation of how important dharma is also diluted in most of these places. So therefore, you have, for the most part, you have Hindu American kids growing up in homes that are, again, that are raising very good citizens, that are raising exceptional American citizens, but mostly confused. In the few cases where they are learning about the Hindu culture, it almost feels like orthogonal to the rest of their world. So that is some of the panelists before this were talking about, hey, we are all spiritual but not religious. Whatever that means. It also almost means that I've just taken the end result, the ultimate result, and I'm just aspiring for that without doing any hard work. As any one of us knows, you cannot get fit without actually putting the exercise. You cannot just say, I am fit, but I'm not rigorous about my fitness. It doesn't exist. Anybody who's telling themselves is kidding themselves. So therefore, you have a lot of confused people who, when push comes to shove, will shy away from identifying themselves as Hindus, and in fact, actually deny themselves the treasure trove that comes to them almost for free as their inheritance of the ages of the Sanatan Dharma that has withstood 5,000 plus years, 10,000 plus years of all kinds of thought. So again, this is my observation of past and present. what does the future look like? The future, like all of us know, is in our hands. Yeah, it's really what we do today, what we have been doing yesterday, and what we will do the next few days, next few years, that will shape the future. The first thing that I want to be a little controversial and I want to say is that as each of us, we must disabuse ourselves of some of our most often repeated phrases that all religions are the same. They are not the same, because when you say all religions are same, there is an assumption that says that every school of thought aspires for the same goal. I think we have to understand that different schools of thought aspire for different goals. Sanatana Dharma aspires for the completeness of oneself into the Paramatma. If that is the goal, this is the fastest way. So to understand your goal, in order to set your journey to understand your goal, firstly, understand your own goals for yourself and your families. Then once you have understood that goals, set out for that path, then reinforce for everyone that is a parent or a future parent. Most children, my own included, do not do as I say, they do as I do. If I ask them to do puja while I am watching TV, chances are they will stand in front of my mandir and exactly wondering about when they can get back on their TikTok or whatever else. If you bring them to the temple and the most of the time you're just focused in socializing and you're not really praying, chances are they think that it's just a social activity and it doesn't really have as much weight for them. If you take them to a Bal Vihar, but do not bring the rigor of Bal Vihar, do not spend the time asking them, what have you learned? What does that really mean? What has that made you think? Chances are they're going to think of this as just another thing that they just have to go through the motions, get a checkbox, and maybe at the end of the year get a graduation certificate and bring you back. And if you do not spend the time doing a puja in its earnest, whatever else somebody else is telling will seem like it's, again, noise, white noise. So I request each of us as parents and as future parents and people interested in building a strong Sanatana Dharma based society to each spend the time to understand. To educate your child, you must educate yourself. Spend the time to understand. Then if this is important to you, if this is important to your child, invest the time in them. Invest the time, be it have a shrine, have a puja mandir in your temple, make that the most in your house, make that the most important room. Do not put it off in a closet. Even if space allowed, please make it the most important part of your room. Dedicate a portion of your house for it. Make it the central part of your house so that you cannot pass by that room without actually spending the time. Teach your children what it means to actually have a relationship with Paramatma. What does religion really mean? What does each ritual lead up to? The rituals are not, as all of us know, the rituals are not an orthogonal activity. They are to enable that focus. Yoga by itself is not a set of calisthenics. Yoga by itself was taught only to train you for the deep periods of meditation. That was the goal. So teach your children what that is. And then please encourage the Bal Vihars around you. Every time you remove your child from a Bal Vihar because a school activity or something else takes precedence, you have just declared at that minute, even if you have not said, you have just declared to your child, this is no longer important. So please invest in your local temples. Please contribute. Please speak to your children with where your energy is, whether financial, emotional, physical energy, and speak to them, direct them with your energy and reinforce everything that you hear and reinforce a sense of curiosity. With that, Rakhi, back to you.
Thank you, Parnaji. This was a very tight topic to do in 1 hour. We have our full conference next year. I hope everyone will attend. There were lots of questions actually that we got for all of the panelists. There were lots of questions I had for the panelists. But unfortunately, we are out of time. But I do want to close on one thing that was said in the World Hindu Congress in 2018 by Santosh Kalyan, who is she's one of the ministers in the South African government. She had said that there was a movement in South Africa where after 4, 5, 6 generations of Indians living in South Africa, there's a movement to ask Hindus and Indians to leave South Africa and go back to India. And her response is, we don't even have family in India. We don't have any connections. Where would we go? We are South Africans. But because Indians have not gotten involved politically in the media and in the spheres of influence, and they've only focused on making money, they are in a situation today where they're trying to survive in their homeland, or in their land which they've considered home. So my takeaway from what everyone has said is that it is up to us to invest in our kids, in our local politicians, in the educational structure, in the media, to get our message out. Whatever our differences, we need to stay focused and invest together in our future. So please join us next year for the conference. And thank you. Namaste. Thank you all for joining us today.